All right, everyone, we're going to wrap up Unit 4 with Chapter 14, our lymphatic and immune system. So our lymphatic system helps with fluid balance. It has a role in fat absorption that we're not going to get into much, and we're going to focus primarily on its role in our defense system in the form of our immune system. So here's a map of our lymphatic system. Typically, when you see lymph vessels, they're going to be depicted in green on a diagram. So red for arteries, blue for veins, and green for our lymph vessels. They're also going to have these little checkpoints or dots along the way. We call those lymph nodes, and they act kind of like security checkpoints for our immune system as fluid is traveling through the lymph vessels, but we'll talk about that a bit more. You can see our lymphatic system is quite widespread throughout the body. It mirrors our circulatory system in a lot of ways, and there's a multitude of different tissues and locations that are involved in our lymphatic or immune system. This picture on the right here, you can see in this darker colored portion of the body, this is the portion of the body that is drained by our right lymphatic duct. So the right arm, the right side of the chest and abdomen, the right side of the neck and head. Our thoracic duct drains the entire left side of the head, neck, and upper body, the left arm, the pelvic region for both sides, and both lower extremities. So these ducts come all the way back and they end up emptying into our venous system to eventually empty back to the right atrium or bring fluid back to the heart. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So we're going to go through the components of our system here. So the lymph itself is the name for the fluid that enters via our lymphatic capillaries. It's composed primarily of water and some solutes. So more or less, this is kind of the plasma portion of blood once it enters our lymphatic system. So our lymphatic capillaries are what actually uptake that fluid. So we have lymphatic capillaries intertwined in the capillary beds where we have our arterioles and venules meeting down at the tissue level. And so some of that plasma or fluid that doesn't make it back into our venules is going to be uptaken by the lymphatic capillaries. So they're quite tiny, just like our regular capillaries, just single layer of tissue. They're going to bring fluid in. Most tissues have a lymphatic capillary in their capillary bed network, and they're going to form to bigger lymphatic vessels. So our lymphatic vessels resemble our smaller veins, and this is what our lymphatic capillaries are going to feed that lymph to. Just like our veins, they contain those one-way valves. So our lymph vessels are only traveling one direction. They're bringing fluid back to the heart in the long run. And so they have those valves to prevent fluid flowing back in the opposite direction. So we said the right lymphatic duct drains that upper limb on the right side and our head, neck, and chest on the right side. It's going to empty into our right subclavian vein. And if you remember from our last chapter, that's one of the veins that we reach prior to our vena cava. The thoracic duct is on the left side and it gets everything else. So the whole left side of the upper body, the pelvis, and both legs. And it empties into our left subclavian vein. So this picture kind of depicts what it would look like. We have a capillary bed or network here. So we have our arterial side and venule side in the exchange of fluid and nutrients. And so some of the fluid that doesn't make it into our tissue cells or back into the venules is going to be sucked up by the lymphatic capillaries, and they're going to pass that to the lymph vessels. So then our lymph vessels have these valves, just like our veins, to make sure that the fluid is flowing in the proper direction and we don't get any backflow. Our tonsils are actually lymphatic organs, and we have three different types. We have a palatine tonsil that's on either side of the mouth. We have our pharyngeal tonsils. Those are going to be near our nasal cavity. And then we have our lingual tonsils that lie on the posterior surface of the tongue. And in a sense, if we put all three of those together, we would form a protective ring of tissue around our nose and mouth. So this just shows our different locations here, and it kind of creates a whole ring. All right, I mentioned lymph nodes briefly at the start. They're rounded structures. They kind of vary in size depending on how much fluid is flowing through that area, kind of how much they're responsible for cleaning. And so they're near our lymphatic vessels. We have some big groupings in our groin, our armpit, and our neck. And so to get back to the heart, they have to go through a few lymph nodes. And these lymph nodes are going to have a higher concentration of white blood cells, and namely phagocytic white blood cells that are going to be able to get rid of foreign material, viruses, bacteria, cells of our own bodies that are not functioning well or are damaged. And so we're trying to clear out all the junk before it gets back to the heart. And so we have white blood cells called lymphocytes. Those are our B cells and T cells that are activated when foreign substances are detected. And as I was just saying, we can remove some of those microbes via macrophages, where are cells that eat up other debris and material. So this shows the structure of a lymph node. You see it's going to flow into the lymph node, or our lymph node is going to have its own blood flow here with an artery and a vein, and it kind of travels throughout this network in here, and then white blood cells are able to pop into the fluid, get rid of the stuff that it should, and then send it back through the lymph vessel. The spleen is another important lymphatic organ. It's only about the size of our fist. It's located in our abdomen, and its main job is filtering blood. So just like our lymph nodes, it has groups of tissue that are kind of monitoring blood as it passes through, and they're able to send macrophages out into the bloodstream to eat up bacteria, foreign material, dead cells that shouldn't be there. The spleen focuses especially on red blood cells, and not only does it get rid of and recycle old red blood cells, but it serves as a storage center or reservoir for excess red blood cells when we need to interject them into the system. And so this is the spleen here. We're not going to go super into detail into the structure here. Just know it has a white pulp that contains a majority of our white blood cells. And then we have a red pulp where a lot of our actual blood is flowing through. Our thymus gland is kind of a double-lobed gland that sits right between our lungs. It's a lot larger in proportion in kids, and eventually, as we get older, around age 60, it actually starts to shrink. So kind of birth to one, it continues to grow pretty large, and then over time, it's going to stay the same and eventually decrease. And that's because it's much more active when we're younger. Its job is to produce and mature lymphocytes, specifically our T lymphocytes. So think T for thymus, T cell. And so our T cells are going to mature and kind of be trained within our thymus gland prior to becoming a functioning part of our immune system. So our thymus is kind of right here, almost on top of the heart, in between the lungs. And here's just a brief overview of the lymphatic system and how it interacts with our circulatory system. So not too much to go into here. The main thing I want to just emphasize is that our lymphatic system is only going to flow or have fluid flowing in one direction. It is going to pull some fluid out at the capillary level, and eventually it is adding that fluid or lymph back to our veins prior to reaching the heart. So it's only flowing back to the heart. So immunity itself is the main focus for this chapter, and that's our ability to resist damage from foreign substances. So that can be microbes, toxins, cancer cells within our own body. That includes bacteria, viruses, fungus, kind of anything that's not supposed to be there. We break it into two broad categories of innate and adaptive. Innate is what we'll start with. That's what you're born with. So innate means present at birth. It's going to be non-specific. So no matter what type of pathogen, our innate immunity is going to try to defend against it. So it's accomplished primarily by physical barriers, chemical mediators, certain cells, and the inflammatory response is a part of our innate immunity. And so what is important here is that it's non-specific, any pathogen. So for example, our skin as one of our physical barriers, it doesn't care if it's a virus or a bacteria or a fungus on it. It's going to try to keep them all out the same way. So our physical barriers like our skin and mucous membranes are our first line of defense. The whole idea is that we're trying to keep things out. We don't have to fight them off if they never get inside. So some examples besides our skin and mucous membranes like the mouth and nose is our tears, saliva, and urine all help to wash away pathogens or toxins that may be near places that we can have entry into the body. Some chemical mediators, we don't talk about these a ton with the innate immune system because they're just a small part, but we have lysozymes. These are in tears and saliva that can help kill bacteria. And we have our mucous membranes, which kind of act as kind of a sticky barrier to catch foreign material and microbes, and they're going to have white blood cells there that can help sweep them out of the way. Histamine is a very important one. And so this is a pro-inflammatory mediator. So it's going to encourage inflammation, and it does that by vasodilating, making our blood vessels wider. And remember, that's going to allow more blood flow to that area. One last one is interferons. And so we're not going to get into too much specifics with these, but they are proteins that protect against viruses. And so they help to signal and stimulate cells that will produce antiviral proteins. So they're part of our response to a virus. Getting more specifically into the cells of the immune system, some of these we were introduced to back in chapter 11, but our white blood cells are the primary element that are going to be our blood cell in the immune system. So they're produced in our red bone marrow, but they're also produced in a few different lymphatic tissues. And we're going to have a lot of different types that fight foreign substances in various ways. Some of our most common ones are phagocytic cells. And so these are going to be our cells that actually eat or ingest foreign substances. Our main examples are our neutrophils. That's the most common white blood cell. And then our macrophages are another one. Think you has phage right in, bag, right in its name. So like I said, neutrophils are our most abundant. They're the first ones to respond, but they die pretty quickly. So they get to the site of infection or issue, they eat up stuff that shouldn't be there, and then they're done with their job. They kind of die off. You can almost think of it how a bee stings something that it thinks it is needs to defend itself again. Its stinger falls out and it dies. That's kind of like our neutrophils. Our eosinophils, much less common than neutrophils. These are produced in our red bone marrow, and these are going to release chemicals to reduce inflammation. So they're anti-inflammatory. Our eosinophils also are the one type of white blood cell that are going to fight against fungus. Our basophils, these are associated with our inflammatory response. They're going to leave our bloodstream and enter an infected tissue when they are signaled, and these release histamine to kind of start up that inflammatory response. And then just so we cover, I don't think I have it laid out here, but you should know the 4 classic signs of inflammation. You probably read about those already if you did your textbook reading. But our 4 classic signs are pain, redness, heat, and swelling. Pain, redness, heat, and swelling. Those are our 4 classic signs of the inflammatory response. And the inflammatory response, the whole idea is that we're getting blood cells to the area in need. So it's how we make sure we get enough blood flow so that we can get white blood cells to that area. All right, macrophages. This is our other main phagocytic cell outside of our neutrophils. Remember, these are initially called monocytes. They start off as monocytes and then they become macrophages. They leave the blood and enter tissues. They can ingest more than neutrophils just because they're larger. And their main job is to protect our lymph within the lymph nodes. And we also find a lot of these in our spleen and liver where we have a high blood flow. You can kind of ignore this last bullet here. It's just saying that we call our macrophages different names depending on where they are. So for example, the macrophages in the liver are known as Kupffer cells, but they're still macrophages. A couple other cells that we'll talk about, mast cells. These are going to be found in the skin, lungs, gastrointestinal tract, our digestive tract, and the urogenital tract or our urinary system. And so these are going to release leukotrienes. Leukotrienes are some chemicals that help to signal other white blood cells to the area. And that's kind of